The crude beast from the east, June 22, 1941. Early morning light fracturing the forests near Ravaruska, Ukraine. The air is thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and freshly churned earth. You are positioned just behind the lead elements of Panzer Group 1, part of the massive armored spearhead of Operation Barbarossa. The sound is deafening. The rhythmic clatter of tank tracks, the guttural roar of Maybach engines, and the distant crump of artillery fire announcing the invasion of the Soviet Union. Oberleutnant Karl Fischer, commander of a Panzer III Ausf. J, wipes the condensation from his periscope. His tank is the pinnacle of early German engineering, precise, complex, and reliable, armed with a potent $50/text $dollar cannon. Fischer feels a wave of professional confidence. Intelligence reports confirmed the Red Army's tanks were generally obsolete, relics of the 1930s. That confidence lasted exactly 2 hours. The first contact came from an unexpected direction, well beyond the initial defensive perimeter. A column of Soviet tanks, retreating chaotically, stumbled into Fischer's battalion. Among them was an unfamiliar silhouette, low, broad, and aggressively squat. Fischer zoomed his optic onto the closest unknown tank. It looked crudely finished, almost barbaric. The welds were rough, the seams uneven, and the paint was sloppily applied. Its turret was huge, cast in a rough, dome-like shape that lacked the crisp, geometric lines of the German design philosophy. A T-34, muttered Sergeant Otto Krenz, the gunner, referencing a vague pre-invasion intelligence sketch. Looks like they rushed it out of the factory. Look at the mudguards, Oberleutnant Hayri barely attached. Indeed, the early production quality of the Soviet tank was abysmal. German commanders, viewing grainy inspection photos in the preceding weeks, had often dismissed the tank based purely on its aesthetic finish. They saw the rough edges, the exposed bolts, and the simplified components as proof of inferior Soviet technology and manufacturing. This was a machine built by peasants, not precision engineers. General Heinz Guderian, the patron saint of the Blitzkrieg, later famously remarked that the Soviet tanks had a shockingly primitive appearance. The underlying arrogance was clear. Tactical superiority lay with sophisticated German engineering. As Fischer gave the order to engage, he directed Krenz to aim for the frontal hull of the T-34. The range was an easy $500/text meters $. Krenz fired a Panzergranate $39 tungsten cord shell. The crack of the $50/text $dollar gun was sharp. The shell flew true and impacted dead center on the Soviet hull with a violent flash of light and a loud metallic clang. Fischer expected to see the frontal armor shatter or the shell penetrate, followed by the satisfying burst of fire inside the enemy tank. Instead, the projectile ricocheted skyward with a scream, leaving nothing but a faint, blackened graze mark. Silence fell over Fischer's tank crew, broken only by the continued rumbling of the engine. The crude T-34 was entirely unfazed. The crew commander, visible briefly above the T-34's turret, turned his attention towards Fischer's position. In his hands, the T-34's main weapon, an unexpectedly long, menacing $76.20/text $dollar gun, began to traverse slowly. The geometry of deflection in his hands, the T-34's main weapon, an unexpectedly long, menacing $76.20/text $dollar gun, began to traverse slowly. The realization was immediate and terrifying. Oberleutnant Fischer's Panzer III was facing a cannon that utterly outclassed his own $50/text $dollar weapon. The Soviet gun was not just larger, it was capable of throwing a heavier, more destructive shell with a muzzle velocity sufficient to punch straight through the frontal armor of his tank at $1,000/text meters $. Fischer immediately ordered a rapid reverse. Before they could execute the maneuver, the T-34 fired. The roar of the $76.20/text $dollar gun was distinctively heavy. The shell slammed into a neighboring Panzer III, not with a ricochet, but with a catastrophic explosion. The Panzer III's turret was instantly pierced, followed by a bright flash of fire as the ammunition cooked off. The German tank was rendered a burning wreck in seconds. Fischer's initial shock, however, stemmed from the T-34's armor. The Soviet design philosophy was drastically different from the German approach. While the Germans relied on thick, vertical plates of face-hardened armor for protection, the T-34 used sloped armor, particularly a $45/text $dollar plate angled steeply at $60/text degrees $dollar on the glacis plate. This geometry meant that when Fischer's $50/text $dollar shell struck the T-34, it didn't hit $45/text $dollar of metal square on. Due to the angle, The shell had to penetrate armor equivalent to nearly $90 $, of vertical plateau thickness far exceeding the capacity of the Panzer III's gun. The shell simply glanced off, unable to bite into the steel, converting the kinetic energy into a harmless ricochet. This was the core of the Japanese mockery. The Russian engineers, lacking the sophisticated tungsten core ammunition and advanced optics of the Germans, had focused on survivability and simplicity. They used a basic but revolutionary concept of physics: the angle of incidence to achieve superior protection with less mass, allowing the tank to remain relatively light and fast. Fischer's retreat turned into a rout. The German $50 $, guns were useless against the T-34's frontal arc, forcing the Panzer crews to expose their weaker flank and rear armor to attack. Even the powerful $88 flak anti-aircraft guns, which were usually devastating against all enemy tanks, struggled against the T-34 when encountering its heavily sloped lower front hull. News of the T-34's performance spread like wildfire through the invasion forces. Initial reports from tank commanders like Fischer, detailing the tank's immunity to standard German anti-tank weaponry, were initially met with skepticism at Oberkommando des Heers. The generals simply couldn't believe a primitive Soviet machine could outclass their most advanced medium tanks. However, the rapidly mounting casualty reports soon changed the tune. The T-34, along with the heavy KV-1, had introduced the concept of the Schreck, the terror, to the German infantry and panzer crews. A crisis had erupted on the Eastern Front, forcing German engineers to scramble for an immediate, tactical solution to counter the new armored threat that German arrogance had so fatally underestimated. The race for a solution. A crisis had erupted on the Eastern Front, forcing German engineers to scramble for an immediate, tactical solution to counter the new armored threat that German arrogance had so fatally underestimated. The reports filtering back to Berlin were unambiguous. The $50 kilowatt K $38 L. 42 guns on the majority of Panzer III's were largely ineffective against the T-34's frontal armor. Even the kilowatt K $39 L60, a longer, more powerful version of the $50 struggled at anything beyond point-blank range. German tank crews, seasoned by victories in France and Poland, were suddenly facing tanks they couldn't reliably destroy. This tactical shock triggered an urgent, frantic race for a solution. Initial efforts focused on modifying existing hardware. German ordnance engineers hastily developed new, more powerful ammunition for the $50 $a guns, including AP-40 armor-piercing, composite-rigid rounds with tungsten cores. But these were scarce and still only effective at very close ranges, often requiring multiple hits. More critically, a frantic effort was initiated to upgun the existing Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. The Panzer III was quickly fitted with the longer, high-velocity $50 kilowatt K $39 L60 gun. More significantly, the Panzer IV, originally designed as an infantry support tank with a short $75 howitzer, underwent a dramatic transformation. It was equipped with the much more powerful, long-barreled $75 kilowatt K $40 L43 and later the even longer L48 gun. These new guns finally gave German forces a reliable capability to penetrate the T-34's frontal armor at combat ranges. However, these modifications were reactive, not proactive, and required precious time and resources. The German war machine, accustomed to rolling over its adversaries with superior tanks, was now playing catch-up beyond immediate armament upgrades. The sheer mobility of the T-34 was another shock. Its wide tracks, superior power-to-weight ratio, and robust Christie suspension allowed it to traverse the infamous Rasputitsa, mud season, and rough terrain of the Eastern Front far more effectively than the narrower-track German tanks. This meant the T-34 could often outmaneuver German forces, appearing where they were least expected, further compounding their tactical difficulties. General Erich von Manstein, a brilliant strategist, noted in his memoirs the profound impact of this new enemy. The surprising appearance of the Russian T-34 tank had to be admitted. It was vastly superior to our then-existing armor. The psychological impact on German tank crews was immense. The initial laughter at the T-34's crude appearance had been replaced by a chilling respect, even fear. The sight of a T-34 advancing, its sloping armor shrugging off shots, instilled a new kind of dread on the battlefield. The anecdotes became legend, German panzer commanders reporting dozens of hits on a T-34, only for it to continue fighting. This fundamental re-evaluation of tank design and combat doctrine culminated in a decisive order from the WWII Prof. 6, Department for Development and Testing of Motorized Equipment. A delegation of top German engineers and armor experts, including Ferdinand Porsche and officials from Henschel, was dispatched to the front lines to directly examine captured T-34s. Their mission: to understand the Soviet terror and rapidly develop German tanks that could match or surpass it. The T-34, once a laughingstock, was now the benchmark. The T-34's blueprint German The T-34, once a laughingstock, was now the benchmark. The German technical delegation's examination of the captured T-34-76 in late 1941 was less a technical inspection and more a revelation. The captured machines, often battle-damaged but intact enough for study, were dismantled and analyzed piece by piece. The engineers, accustomed to the intricate, over-engineered complexity of German tanks, were stunned by the Soviet design simplicity. They confirmed that the sloped armor was the primary defensive genius. The Germans had previously dismissed this concept for production reasons, favoring vertical armor because it was easier to manufacture, machine, and assemble with high precision. The T-34's rough, cast turret and large, simple hull plates, however, allowed the Soviets to utilize high angles without demanding German-level manufacturing tolerances. Ferdinand Porsche himself took extensive notes on the T-34's $60 degree $0 glacis plate, recognizing the immense effective thickness it achieved. Beyond the armor, the delegation was deeply impressed by the T-34's mechanical ruggedness. The wide, simple steel tracks, often derided for their crude finish, provided superior flotation over mud and snow compared to the complex, interleaved German road wheels. The powerful V2 diesel engine, designed originally for aircraft, gave the T-34 excellent power and speed, and its use of diesel fuel provided better range and reduced fire risk compared to the petrol engines in German Panzers. The German engineers' report to OKH was blunt. It detailed the necessity of adopting the T-34's core features: sloping armor, integrating heavily sloped plates into all new tank designs, long-barrel high-velocity gun, standardizing a powerful $75 dollar gun capable of defeating the T-34 at long range, wider tracks and robust suspension, improving cross-country mobility, particularly for the harsh Eastern Front terrain. The realization was that the T-34 was not merely an advanced tank, it represented an entirely different, highly effective philosophy of armored warfare tailored for the Soviet operational theater. The Soviet approach prioritized lethality, survivability, and rugged mobility over comfort, optics, and precise engineering, finished the very qualities the Germans had initially mocked. This moment of clarity led directly to the most significant development in German armored history: the birth of the Panther tank. Hitler ordered the WWII 6 to immediately develop a new medium tank that directly copied the successful features of the T-34 while incorporating superior German optics and armament. The initial design brief explicitly mentioned the T-34's sloped armor and wide tracks as mandatory requirements. The T-34 was no longer just a tank the German army feared. It had become the template for the next generation of German armored vehicles. The laughter had definitively ceased, replaced by the frenetic, desperate work of imitation. The birth of the Panther, the T-34, was no longer just a tank the German army feared. It had become the template for the next generation of German armored vehicles. The laughter had definitively ceased, replaced by the frenetic, desperate work of imitation. The transformation from T-34 analysis to German armored reality culminated in the debut of the Panzerkampfwagen V Panther in mid-1943, designed specifically to dominate the tank it was forced to imitate. The Panther was the ultimate, concrete admission that the early German confidence in their technical superiority, based on complex, vertical armor and high-precision optics, was a profound strategic error. The influence of the T-34 on the Panther was undeniable and immediate. The Panther featured a massive, well-engineered glacis plate angled at $55 degrees, even steeper than the T-34's $60 degrees, in some sections, but with much thicker armor at $80 This design principle, entirely borrowed from the crude beast, made the Panther frontally almost impenetrable to the Soviet $76.20 gun that had terrorized the Panzer III crews. Furthermore, the Panther incorporated the essential mobility features of the T-34. It used a wider track system to cope with the soft Russian terrain and a complex torsion bar suspension to achieve superior cross-country speed and stability, though its complexity far exceeded the Soviet Christie suspension. However, the Germans refused to fully abandon their own technical strengths. They integrated the T-34's best features with German state-of-the-art technology, correcting the T-34's primary weakness, its inadequate gun. The Panther was armed with the formidable $7.50 cm $kilowatt K $42 L-70 cannon, a long-barreled, high-velocity weapon that could reliably penetrate the T-34's frontal armor at ranges exceeding $1,500 text meters $. This was a direct answer to the firepower gap encountered by Oberleutnant Fischer in 1941. The baptism of fire for the Panther came during the massive armored confrontation at Kursk in July 1943. While the Panther suffered severe teething problems, engine fires, transmission failures, and mobility issues stemming from the hurried, complex design, its combat performance against the T-34-76 was devastating. German crews, now operating a tank that combined the T-34's survivability with superior German optics and firepower, found themselves able to destroy T-34s at extreme distances while remaining functionally immune to return fire from the Soviet tank's primary weapon. Yet, this moment of technical parity came too late. The Soviet Union had spent the 2 years since 1941 pouring thousands of T-34s into the fight. The T-34 simplicity, which the Germans had mocked, allowed it to be mass-produced at a rate the complex Panther could never match. The German war economy struggled to produce more than 6,000 Panthers during the entire war, while the Soviets churned out nearly 60,000 T-34s. The German technical solution, though brilliant, was an admission of strategic defeat. The T-34 had forced the Germans into an arms race that their industrial base, strained by the two-front war and Allied bombing, could not possibly win. The laugh had cost them the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The total cost of arrogance. The German technical solution, though brilliant, was an admission of strategic defeat. The T-34 had forced the Germans into an arms race that their industrial base, strained by the two-front war and Allied bombing, could not possibly win. The laugh had cost them the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The T-34's legacy for the German High Command was not simply about replacing the Panzer III with the Panther, it was about the forced, complete overhaul of their armored philosophia, a revolution born of tactical humiliation and strategic necessity. The Soviet tank had exposed the brittle inflexibility of the German industrial mindset. In the long run, the T-34's impact was measured not just in destroyed panzers, but in diverted German production capacity. The hurried development and introduction of the $75 L-43 or 48 gun on the Panzer IV and the entirely new Panther tank consumed millions of man-hours and vast quantities of increasingly scarce chrome and tungsten strategic materials that were critical for everything from submarine parts to high-performance engines. This focus pulled resources away from essential areas, such as mass-producing simpler, reliable equipment or defensive anti-tank guns. Major General Fridolin von Sengo-Undettelen, a Panzer commander, later summarized the profound realization that struck the German command. The genius of the T-34 lay in its balance of combat power and mass manufacturability. While the Panther was technically superior to the T-34-76 and roughly equal to the later T-34-085, its complexity, its highly sophisticated transmission, interleaved road wheels, and demanding production tolerance meant that it required 3 times the manufacturing effort of a T-34. The Soviet tank, with its simplified construction, became the Red Army's industrial backbone. It could be built in massive tank factories in the Urals and Siberia, often by female and teenage workers, and driven straight to the front in numbers that overwhelmed any technical advantage the Germans gained with the Panther. The German laughter over the T-34's crude welds and sloppy paint had simply been laughter at the Soviet Union's capacity for wartime mass production. Ultimately, the German commanders who laughed at the T-34's appearance in 1941 were forced, by 1943, to acknowledge that they were not fighting a superior vehicle in isolation, but an unbeatable economic model. The T-34 became the defining symbol of the Eastern Front, forcing German armored doctrine to become defensive and reactive, signaling the decisive loss of the strategic initiative. The joke was over. The fear of being overwhelmed by sheer numbers was real.